Good evening. Welcome back to the Bible Speaks today for part 2 of many parts. Part 2 of our Cities in the Bible series, talking about the city of Shechem. Okay. Last week we were trying some, they're not new things, but they're new for this program, trying to integrate some of our images and things like that into the program. And it seemed to work out fairly well, at least what we saw. And obviously, if you want to make a comment about that, the email comes up on the screen from time to time. By all means, let us know. We hope as we get more practiced at this, because we're using new equipment, and we were good with the old equipment years ago. Then as we've improved, we lost the art of doing some of the things that we used to do. So we're having to go back and, re-educate ourselves. But it's working out anyway. You'll remember that I finished up last week talking how Shechem first appears in the Bible in Genesis chapter 12, and that records how Abraham reached the great tree of Morah at Shechem and offered sacrifices nearby. And that's featured, or that's mentioned in Genesis, Deuteronomy, and most of the early books of the Bible. They call Shechem the most holy city of all the other cities in the land of Israel. Of course, they hadn't conquered it all yet by then, but that's what they do. And at Shechem, Abraham built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him and given him the land to the descendants. Remember the Genesis verses about that. And it says, of course, that God confirmed the covenant he'd made with Abraham back in Haran. And there's a picture coming up in a second or two, which is of some archaeological, there it is, some archaeological digs in Shechem, which is reputed to be the site, if not, I don't know, it's the actual stones, but the site of where the altar that Abraham worshipped on. Archaeology, who knows? I don't know how they can tell. Okay, thanks, chaps. The Jewish tradition, the name was understood in the terms of the Hebrew word, okay, which is Shechem, which means, as I said last week, shoulder or saddle, corresponding to the mountainous configuration of the place. Now, if you remember, you saw a picture, and we'll see one later on, of where the two mountains come together, and it sits in the like the saddle of the two mountains. So that's where the name came from in the Hebrew Bible. Later on, of course, the two sons of Jacob, Simeon, from the Hebrew Bible, and Levi. You remember the story about the sister Diana, who was raped by Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land of Shechem? You remember that? They avenged her rape, if you remember, by massacring the city's inhabitants. Later, after the Exodus, Joshua assembled the Israelites in Shechem and commanded them to reaffirm their adherence to the Torah, to the word, okay? And then Shechem was given as a Levitical city. Now, a Levitical city means the priests, okay? To the Kohathites, okay, which were the priestly group, owing to first of all its central position. As I said last week, it's right bang in the middle of the whole area, and to the presence of places hallowed by the memory of Abraham. If you read Genesis 12:6 or 7, and later on, it's pretty explicit in there. Jacob's well is there. Jacob's well. Now, we'll talk more about Jacob's well in a minute, but your homework, if you will, is to figure out what the relationship is between Jacob's well and Jesus, because it's there. And Joseph's tomb. If you'll remember, in the Bible it tells you that Joseph wanted to be buried in his homeland. And it took a great deal of time for the Israelites to travel from Egypt to the Promised Land, didn't it? And it always bothered me a little bit that, what did they do? Just carry his bones around with them? And then somebody in the crew mentioned today during the break that, hang on a bit, the Egyptians were good at mummification, weren't they? Maybe they preserved the body of Joseph in a coffin, and that's what they did, which makes perfectly good sense, of course. So perhaps that's what happened to Joseph. Anyway. But anyway, the city was really destined, if you will, to play an important part in the history of Israel. I mean, the city itself, including its Bronze Age temple, which is a Canaanite temple, fell to the Israelites sometime before 1000 BC. Okay? You remember, they were at the time of Jericho. Remember we talked a few weeks ago about Jericho and how the Israelites, when they came through, it was empty, and that was around the 1300 time. So it's obviously a bit, between 1300 and 1000 BC, the Israelites took over Shechem. And after Gideon's death, you remember Gideon? Yes, of course you do. Abimelech, his son, I didn't know it was by a concubine. I did not know that. I obviously didn't read Judges very well, because in Judges 9 it tells you about the Shechemite concubine and how Abimelech was made king. And Jotham, the youngest son of Gideon, made a big allegorical speech on Mount Gerizim, in which he warned the people of Shechem about Abimelech's future tyranny. Okay, now Jotham was not a fan of Abimelech, and as we find out later, when we get on later, he was absolutely right. But he got up on the Mount Gerizim and made a speech. Now, in the picture that's coming up, you will see how the two mountains, and I showed you one before, the two mountains sit either side of this saddle. And in fact, if you stand on, I think Gerizim's on the left. If you stand on the mountain in the left there, and you speak, and there's a crowd of people in the new town of Shechem is in front of that, but in the saddle there is the old town of Shechem, and if you speak on one side, it's heard very clearly on the other side. In other words, it's like a mini amphitheater, as I said before. So he made this big speech, okay? And the mountains are really, really close. It's not a very big gap. And in fact, the original town of Shechem was really quite small, okay? But it forms a kind of natural amphitheater between them. Okay, so when the city rose in rebellion against Abimelech, okay, 3 years later, he took it, burnt it down, and burnt down the old Bronze Age temple of Baal Berith, where the people had fled for safety. I mean, I guess the temple was still there, and used in some form or other, okay? And we learn from excavations that it was destroyed in around 1100 BC, which kind of fits the time frame. It's so gratifying to me, and I'm sure to other Bible scholars, when they look at something that happened and try and figure out the timeline, and then they do some excavations and find out that the archaeological evidence absolutely sits the timeline. Okay? So, the city was rebuilt in about the 10th century and was probably the capital of Ephraim. If you read 1 Kings, and I hope you're making notes of all these Bible books I'm mentioning, because there'll be questions afterwards. And Shechem was the place appointed after Solomon's death for the meeting of the people of Israel. All right? And the investiture of Rehoboam. Now, Jerusalem was still David's capital, right? But the holy city, the place where if you wanted anything done with a lot of oomph behind it, if you will, was the holy city of Shechem. So Rehoboam went to Shechem, just up from Jerusalem, to be crowned king, and we know what happened there, don't we? The meetings, after the crowning, when Rehoboam was petitioned by the 10 northern tribes to say, look, it's a bit tough. Solomon beat us to death and kept on working us to death for the temple and everything else, and you need to make it a little easier. And Rehoboam's young advisors told him, tell him to take a run, And so we ended up with the secession of the 10 northern tribes. And Rehoboam's successor, Jeroboam, fortified Shechem, which became the capital of the new kingdom. And I'm sure that at the time they thought, well, that's as it should be. This is our most holy city and it's in our territory. Jerusalem, that's just an upstart that only started recently. If you look in 1 Kings and Chronicles, it's all there. But then what happened was that either because it wasn't big enough, I mean, there's always been a problem with water in Shechem, it is today even, but for one thing or the other, the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, moved first to Tirzah and then later to the city of Samaria, which is why, of course, the whole area, they were called Samaritans, right? Instead of Shechemites, they were called Samaritans. And in Jesus' time, there was the whole area of Samaria. There wasn't a northern kingdom anymore, but the people who lived in that area were descendants of the tribes, the people that were left after the conquests of Israel and then after Judah. So it was a different area, if you will. Not so much a country, but as an area. Okay? Shechem loses its importance. Okay? And in fact, we don't hear about it again in the Bible, anyway, until after the fall of Jerusalem in about 587. Okay? We hear it from Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 12. Okay? And the events, you know, we're skipping over the Babylonian captivity and all that, but after the Babylonian captivity, when what they call the restoration, okay, remember that when Nehemiah is trying to build the temple, and Nehemiah made 2 visits to Jerusalem, you remember that, but they're trying to build the temple up and they're trying to make Jerusalem up into a fortified city. And they're getting a lot of resistance from the people around, some of them who were the Sumerians. Okay? So on Nehemiah's second visit, what he does is he expels the grandson of the high priest. Now his name is Eliashib, but in Josephus' Antiquities, he's called Manasseh. Okay? But he was expelled to Shechem. You know, okay, you're a troublemaker, get out of here, go live in Shechem. Okay? But when he left, he took many Jews and many priests and laymen who sided with him, didn't like Nehemiah. So they went to Shechem. And then what they did was they built a temple at Mount Gerizim, Shechem again, on the top of the mountain. And so Shechem became the holy city of the Samaritans. So you can see it kind of ties in when you start reading the New Testament and Jesus' upbringing and the Samaritans and the story of the Good Samaritan. You can realize the animosity between the two. I mean, it was, they basically started another religion. They hadn't. They used the same things or different Bible actually. We talked about that in our Bible studies. But Shechem was in opposition, if you will, to Jerusalem. Okay? Funnily enough, and this I find quite interesting, was that the Samaritans were basically left alone, didn't have much problem with anything, under Antiochus IV, who really gave the Jews in Judah, the old southern kingdom, a really hard time with taxes and oppression and things like that. If you read Josephus' Antiquities, he records it with open arms, not open arms, an open mind. He records everything that went on. And of course, everybody who got fed up with Antiochus's heavy hand in Jerusalem, fled north to Shechem and were welcomed with open arms. I mean, the Antiquities, just a quick word of explanation. Josephus did the Roman wars, history of the Jews, and then he did Jewish Antiquities, which is more like a more detailed history. and he writes a great deal about the what he calls renegades who came from Jerusalem and went up to Shechem. Well, of course, you know, that went on for a while, and then eventually it became the Samaritans' turn, and in about 128 BC, okay, so their temple got destroyed. Again, it's in the Antiquities, and you know, it kind of falls into disuse again. But when they say falls into disuse, you've got to remember, people still lived there. All right, the temple was gone. They didn't get lots of people, you know, what's the word, coming and worshipping and paying tribute. But people still live there. People got to live. People got to, in those days, farm or herd cattle or whatever to live and eat. And so whenever these places were removed from prominence, the rest of the people just carried on. It's one thing, people get the wrong idea about the Babylonian captivity. If, let's say we divide the people up into two groups, the educated intelligentsia, the priests, the nobles, the tax collectors, the politicians, if you will, and then the rest of the people are the farmers and the herders and the coppersmiths and the blacksmiths and all the rest of it. When Nebuchadnezzar took the Jews into captivity, he didn't take the farm people. He still needed them to grow the crops where he could get his tribute and his taxes. He's not stupid. I mean, it's business after all. So the people that went were all the intelligentsia, the scholars, the thinking people, the people who might sit there and go, it's time we revolted or something like that. Most people in that time who lived on the land were more concerned with whether the corn came up or whether the chickens lay or whether there was enough grass for the beef or whatever than they were about rebelling against who it was. And in fact, other than the taxation thing, which they had regardless of who was running the country, if you don't think that the Israelites had a form of taxation on their own people before the captivity, you need to read the Bible a bit more closely. Okay? I mean, all that changed for them was there was a different guy collecting the taxes. I suppose it's a bit like some of us who aren't wealthy or have vast savings or bank accounts in the Caymans. Whatever government comes in, it basically is the same. We just pay our taxes to a different group, don't we? Anyway, that's as political as I'll get, I promise. Anyway, it doesn't appear again. You don't hear about Shechem in the Bible anyway until Acts 7, where it's called Sychem, S-Y-C-H-E-M, which is, you know, neither here nor there. And then it's not really known whether the Sychar in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, there's a place he refers to as Sychar, refers to Shechem or perhaps another village. It's likely that John's referring to the old city of Shechem. All right? Shechem is also the location of Jacob's well. Remember I mentioned Jacob's well last week? Tradition has it that the well was I assume already there when the Israelites got there, but it was called Jacob's well, and because Jacob's tomb is not very far from it, makes sense of course. And Jacob's well, and those of you who've been smart will be putting your hands up saying, yeah, I know. Jacob's well is the well in John chapter 4, which describes Jesus meeting with the woman of Samaria. Okay? So it had been there since ancient times. I will try and get you a picture of the well, because there's a very good picture of it, but I haven't got it with me tonight. Anyway, and some of the inhabitants of Shechem were those Samaritans, remember the story, who believed in Jesus when he spent 2 days in the neighborhood. Now, that in itself is unusual. When Jews had to cross Samaria from Galilee's up here, Jerusalem's down here, Samaria's in the middle, and you had to go to Galilee up and down the country, you had to go through Samaria. And as we know from the story where the chap got beaten by robbers, it wasn't exactly a pleasant thing to do. Okay? So, the other thing too was that the city must have been visited by the apostles on their way to Samaria from Jerusalem. In Acts 8, actually 8:25, it says it very clearly there. So it's not like people didn't travel there. It's just that it wasn't, like going through the bad part of town. You tried to do it as quickly as possible. I mean, just to recap then, in classical history, the classical history, Shechem was the main settlement for the Samaritans, whose religious center stood on Mount Gerizim, which is up above the town, all right? In AD 6, so that would have been when Jesus was 6 years old, 7 years old, something like that, Shechem was annexed to the Roman province of Syria. It wasn't conquered or anything. The Romans just said, okay, from now on, this is part of your bailiwick. Okay, Syria was a Roman province, and so when that happened, what the Samaritans rose up in arms on Mount Gerizim, all right, Gerizim rather, and this was at the time of the really got upset about it, but there wasn't anything they could do. Later on, in the Galilean rebellion in AD 67, which in itself was part of the first Jewish-Roman war, okay, the whole city rose up against the Romans. I mean, never mind about not being friends with the Israelites or the Judeans or the people from the southern side. They rose up in rebellion against the Romans, okay? And it's very likely, because it was destroyed, and the archaeologists believe that it was destroyed during that war, okay? Now, in AD 72, that's an important date, a new city, Flavia Neapolis, was built by Vespasian about a mile and a half away to the west of the old one, which is why the pictures we have showed you last time, it shows you the whole modern town coming down the hill sort of thing. The original town's up in the saddle there. Flavia Neapolis, built by Vespasian. Now, 72, Vespasian in 70 was the Roman general who flattened Jerusalem, knocked the temple down, went on to Masada and did that. He was the guy who put down the Jewish revolt totally. And so rebuilt a new city rather than build on the old ruins. He built a new town, about a mile and a half away. And the city's name was eventually corrupted to the modern city of Nablus. Nablus, actually, not Nablus, okay? And that's the city that the people tend to go to today to go and see Shechem. What's really interesting is Josephus, in about AD 90, 10 years later, placed the city, as always, between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. But elsewhere, of course, he refers to it as Neapolis or Nablus, so the word gets truncated down. In the Emperor Hadrian's reign, still under Roman occupation, the temple on Mount Gerizim was restored and dedicated to Jupiter, so it became a pagan temple. Like the old town of Shechem, and we've understood this for some time now, I think, that Neapolis had a very early Christian community. And I didn't know this, but in doing the research, it included an early saint called Justin Martyr, which many people have heard about. Okay? And on several occasions, the Christians got persecuted by the Samaritans, still going on. All right? You think they might have learned their lesson, but no. In 474, the Roman emperor, to avenge an unjust attack by the Samaritans on the Christians, by that time, of course, the Roman became after Constantine, deprived them of Mount Gerizim and gave it to the Christians, banned the local inhabitants from using it. And they built a church on it, decorated to the Blessed Virgin, the remains of which are still there today. Okay? During the Abbasid and the Ottoman periods, the city of Nablus and Shechem were predominantly Arab. And it wasn't until 1903 a German party of archaeologists literally stumbled on Tel Balata, the original site of Shechem, and began digging and trying to find out what was there. So all the things I've just been talking about really only came to light in a concrete sense in the early part of 1900, 1903, 4 and 5. Shechem today is still a tourist town. It's still regarded as a place to visit. If you look at one of these tours of Israel they advertise, several of them I looked at, they all include Shechem as somewhere to go to get right back into Israel, for Christians, and right back into Israeli history. I mean, obviously Jerusalem, Bethlehem, all those others are included, but Shechem's very much worth a visit. The well is still there, they say. The ruins of the old town are there, and surprisingly enough, if you talk to Israeli or Hebrew speakers in Israel today, Nablus is still referred to as Shechem rather than its more modern name. In other words, the tradition of the place has stayed in people's memories. All right? Okay, that's just a quick potted thing. Next week, I'm not sure. It's either Bethlehem or Bethel or Capernaum. I've got several cities picked out, okay? It's just interesting to see where all these places fit into our Bible. So, read your Bible. For me, good night. God bless.